na 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 na. Bamba. Oh na 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 na. Bamba. Oh na 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 na. Bamba. Oh na 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 na. Big it up. Oh na 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 na. Big it up. Oh na 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 na. Bamba. Bamba 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 de. Bamba bamba. Bamba mi de. Bamba 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 mi de. Bamba bamba. Bamba 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 bamba.
Welcome to Home and Away Jamaica. I'd like to start off by saying I am going to be interviewing my colleague. I'm Paulette Price, my colleague Robert Taylor, attorney at law. And what we decided to do this week is basically try to address a couple of questions that we've received from some of our viewers. And one of the questions that one of the viewers have asked is, I have a large property on a good amount of land and deciding whether to sell as one property or divide into individual lots. The question is there a better option out of the two? What should I expect from either option? Then there's another question, which we'll deal with after. And what does a strata have to be involved? What are the responsibilities of a strata? So let's just take the first question. What is the best option? Selling it as one or dividing it into lots? Question to you.
Hi, Paulette. So, you know, Paulette, we've seen this question before when you and I were on the diaspora tour was it last year?
Yeah, last year. It feels like a million years ago, doesn't it?
Yeah. One of your dear friends who I met had a similar situation where he had family land in the outskirts of Montego Bay.
Yeah.
And his father had done a subdivision of that land into several lots, which had been incomplete. So his question was, you know, should we complete the subdivision or should we just sell this plot of land as one large available parcel of land to someone who can go and develop it and do what they need to do? And I think, you know, it's a similar situation here. We have a number of persons who have migrated, maybe a parent or grandparent, and there's family land back in Jamaica, typically rural Jamaica, you know, outside one of the known cities, whether it's Kingston, Montego Bay. And so the question really, when we say substantial land, let's assume it's an acre or more. What are the options? There are a few options. You can sell that land in its raw state to someone who may choose to do a number of the things that you may have wished to do, but you may not have the resources. And so if you have, say, an acre of land, there are several options. You can, well, let's say 3 or 4 or 5 acres. You could, or more, you could divide them into individual lots and sell lots to persons who want to put up single family dwellings. Or you could develop that lot on your own, and perhaps this is where the strata question came in. You could put up a multi-story dwelling, which could fall under the Strata Titles Act, where you're selling strata units, where each owner owns their own unit, but they have a share in the common areas, and you have a strata management company that manages the property. So there are those two options, either selling outright or selling and developing individual lots that persons can put up single family homes. And then thirdly, putting up a multi-story development. So a lot of other factors will determine which direction you take. And you know, the first one at the foremost is cost. Because if you have a large parcel of land and you're going to at least develop it into lots, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to have to get approvals. So you're going to have to get a land surveyor to help you plan out those lot sizes. You're going to have to apply for new titles. You're going to have to get the approval of the local parish council. You're going to have to get approval from the local planning agencies. You're going to have to get infrastructure in place. And so you're going to have access to water. If there's no public water, then you're going to have to consider water tanks. You know, there's still many places in Jamaica that don't have access to public water. Electricity, you're going to have to bring electricity lines in. You're also going to have to bring you're going to also have to bring sewage facilities and infrastructure in place. And if there's no public sewage for you to connect to, you're going to have to create on-site sewage. So that is going to send the cost of that planning and development exercise up significantly. So if the situation is you've inherited land and you don't have the capital resources to consider a higher value option, which is selling lots, your best bet would be to sell that land to someone who has the resources to develop, or enter into some kind of joint venture or partnership with a developer who you put the land in as your share of the equity in the project, and the developer will contribute all the other hard costs that go towards developing that infrastructure. But I'll stop there because you seem to be bursting with questions. So,
how could you tell? All right, so this is actually a very common question, believe it or not, because even up to yesterday, I got a call from somebody from the UK wanting to do something similar. But what I'm finding with them, Robert, is that they think it can all be done really quickly. And what I'm finding is that a lot of them don't just have like a 1 acre or 5 acre, it's like hundreds of acres that they've inherited from grandparents even. And I think what they're doing is looking at how Jamaica is growing, the real estate industry is growing,
yeah.
And they want to be a part of that as well, which is a good thing actually. But what I don't think they realize is the amount of work and the stages, right? So one of the comments I got yesterday was, I want to do this quickly. And I said, no, you can't. It's not a quick fix. You have to, there's so much about it, because you've actually covered quite a few areas there. You've covered selling it as one, dividing it, or doing a development and doing it as a joint venture. But I don't think they appreciate how much work has to be done, because you know, all the things with the water, the light, the roads, the whole infrastructure and the design of the building. So I think probably what we need to probably do is to kind of get it across to them that it's a lot, this is not a quick fix, and they need to go through it slowly and carefully, because it can be quite expensive, you know, and you know, sometimes they think that I have all this land and I think it's worth X amount of money. A developer should come along, give me some money, and it's easy. We can just go and it'll be done in like 6 months or whatever. So I think probably we need to talk a little bit more as well about the process, like how long the process would take and how long it could take from beginning to the end in terms of dividing it, designing your buildings, building and selling.
Yeah, I think that approach would probably instill a dose of reality. And so,
yes,
you know, the challenges, and I think what is common is that persons perceive that a fully developed parcel of land will provide significant returns, and that the land development and building industry has, you know, very strong financial prospects. What I think we forget sometimes is that developers have a long history and track record and legacy of working through the development process. A developer may have several land banks, and so with this land bank, they're able to develop experience and minimize some of the risks that are involved in execution. So we know the higher the risk, the higher the return. But for someone who has inherited land, has no development or business experience, that expectation of, you know, making this windfall, I think sometimes can be misplaced. So to go back to your initial question, time. Well, let's look at the typical scenario where we may have family land, which may be unregistered land, no title. So the first step is titling that land, bringing it to what we call first registration. That process involves proving title, getting various affidavits from adjoining owners or persons who can, by way of a statement, indicate that this property has been in the family or known to have been in the family for a certain number of years, producing maybe property tax receipts, utility receipts, and so on. So that whole process of land titling has a time element. It also has a cost element. If it's a significant parcel of land, as you've said, acres and acres of land, then it will have to be surveyed. And surveyors sometimes price based on value. And so many persons aren't able to move forward in the process because just the very cost of, you know, getting the professional input, the legal work, the land surveyor can be prohibitive if, you know, the only value or asset you have is this piece of land. So that process of titling can take a year or a little more than a year, maybe a year and a half. So let's round that off to 2 years, realistically. So we now have title. You're going to have the surveyor simultaneously, when you're doing that titling exercise, do a plan showing the individual lots that you want to possibly sell. You're going to have to submit those plans to the local parish council, who, once you get approvals, that approval could be anywhere from 6 months to a year, typically a year, because if you're not on the ground, if it's not a large development, you know, the parish council's pipeline is full with persons who are professional developers, and they're pushing that pipeline. And so if you're an amateur, you're someone not in the industry, you know, you're not going to get your application, unfortunately, pushed through if you're not on top of things the way someone who does this as their livelihood. So that's another year in just getting approvals. Then you're going to have to put infrastructure in place. You're going to have to cut roads. You're going to have to install lighting. You're going to have to connect to the public sewer system, if there is one. If not, you're going to have to put an on-site sewage system. The cost can be anywhere from $300,000 US to 1.2 million US dollars. So it's not a task for the faint-hearted and the persons without the level of resources. Also the risk, the planning risk, the execution risk, the sales risk, all involves, you know, being able to mitigate financial exposure, and if you don't have that level of experience. So you could be looking up to 5 years to get something off the ground, assuming you have the financial resources. Then in relation to the development of land, it's never prudent to borrow to develop land. And in fact, the banks want to see that your land equity is fully accounted for, because land on its own is not generating cash flow to repay loans. So all of these costs that I have been listing are costs that you should invariably be able to cover out of pocket.
So that answers the question for the person who wants to do this in a hurry. I think we probably have to cover this subject again, and we'll probably have to really break it down, because I don't think people understand it really. And what we should try to do for them is to compare it to where they come from. So sometimes I think we still have that reputation in Jamaica where we do things very slowly, but it's not we do it slowly, I don't think. I think it's about being careful as well. And what we are doing now is basically the same thing that we do in the UK. And a lot of the people who are wanting to do these projects anyway, like you said, they don't have the experience. So there's this really steep learning curve. But it's possible, and we don't really want to put people off doing these things. So,
yeah, and you know, Paulette, I think what I see very often is
yeah,
mismatched expectations.
yes,
So family, very emotionally tied to family land.
yes,
You know, each family member, when you think you may have 6 or 7 siblings.
yes,
So the initial thought is if I sell this land for, you know, £500,000 or £200,000, let's take the UK example,
yes,
we're going to have to split it between 6 or 7 people.
yes.
So let's develop it so we have a chance of making 3, 4, 5
More.
million
Yes,
pounds. But then you're going to have to put in substantial sums, and then all of the family members may not be equally yoked.
yes,
And who puts the money up? And then it creates all these issues. And the other issue we have is the developer who says, I'm taking all this risk. Your land, yes, you have 200 acres, but it probably is zoned agricultural land, which may be 2 million an acre. So really, it's my effort and my work that's going to increase the value of this land. So why should I be paying you the future value for my work?
yeah,
So my concern is the mismatched expectations. And sometimes I think persons are better served simply putting the large parcel on the market for sale,
and sell it,
liquidating it, getting some
Yes.
cash and moving on.
Yes. And then sometimes what may even be manageable for them is if they wanted to subdivide it. That may be a little bit easier, but then they're still going to have to service it. So basically put in the roads, water and light anyway. But that would be, to me, that's a little easier than this huge development that a lot of people want to get into. But like you said, it's not for the faint-hearted. And like we always say, engage the services of the professionals. Otherwise, there'll be tears before bedtime, as we would say.
And what I would say also, Paulette, in wrapping up on this point, is that not all land is created equal. So, you know, if you have, you know, 4 acres in Kingston, you know, or even 1 acre,
yes,
the chances of you getting
or even half.
or half acre. I mean, we've seen what's done on a half-acre lot in terms of multi-story dwelling. And so if you have a half acre up to an acre or quarter acre in Kingston, it's very likely that you'll be able to entice a developer with good standing and strong history and reputation to joint venture. That developer may say, put the land in, I'm going to put up 30 2-bedroom units or one bedroom apartment units, and I'll give you 2 or 3 units, or, you know, in exchange, because that land has very high value. As opposed to, you know, land that's maybe in Old Harbor or in somewhere in Clarendon, where there's no public sewage, there's no easy access to water, and you're sending all your infrastructure costs up. A developer may very well have no interest.
Yes.
You know, so.
You know, but you know, I would think would be a really good idea is if government could put in infrastructure in and around, and then developers could then be attracted to go to those areas to develop it. I think that's probably a way forward, rather than leaving all of the infrastructure side to be done piecemeal by developers as they go along. So if they're listening, that's an idea.
Yes, and so your question on strata really comes where you're looking at a multi-story development. Strata really has to do with you owning an individual title, in this instance, in a larger building. So you have vertical walls, you have roofs that are all shared, but you're still able to extract from that plot,
Mm-hmm.
an individual title, and then persons who own that individual plot or unit will all share in the common area of the property. And you share in the cost for lighting that property, water utilities. You may have amenities like a pool, a tennis court. You'll share in all those costs. And that's managed through your Strata corporation that's registered under the Strata Title Act. And those owners are all members and shareholders in that company.
And just for people from the UK who are listening to this, the strata or the maintenance that you pay each month is very similar to the service charge. The difference is that you don't normally own the freehold, you're the leasehold. So we understand leasehold a little bit differently from how when we talk about lease agreement here in Jamaica. So it's very similar. You pay your service charge. It covers all of the common area costs. And I think that usually throws a lot of people coming from the UK not understanding it. But I think you have an advantage here because you actually own the freehold, whereas in the UK, it's the leasehold. Although I do know that the laws are there for people to own the freehold, but it's not very common. But I know that they were trying to educate people to go that route. But I know a lot of blocks of apartments are not like that, but it's not impossible. It's still possible.
Yes, very good point, Paulette. So there's a clear distinction in Jamaica from the UK, where it's very common to have leaseholds, 99-year leases.
Yes.
So these leaseholds have a defined period of ownership, while with the freehold, it's perpetual. Save and except where the Crown may decide to intervene and take back the way the law developed, the Crown owns all land, and by way of freehold, it gives you a perpetual interest until and unless it decides to take it back.
Yeah. So that answers the strata question.
You said you wanted to discuss leases, commercial leases, residential.
Yes, because that's been coming up quite a bit. Are there different types of commercial leases?
Well, we can first draw a distinction between the commercial and residential lease. And what I would say is the courts in general, I mean, both parties have rights. We had this on our program recently, persons from the Rent Assessment Board, and we were talking about the distinction between two leases. And there's this general view that the residential lease, the courts tend to, and the way the statutes are drafted, the tenants, there's this, preponderance of protection for the tenant. And in some cases, that is so. With commercial leases, what we find is that the courts are less likely to intervene in agreements between two parties, because it's presumed that at the commercial level, parties are negotiating from a more sophisticated basis, that the business person has the resources and wherewithal to get legal advice and enter into agreements with landlords, knowing very well what they're getting into. So the courts are less inclined to interfere with those commercial agreements. So what we see with commercial agreements is, less flexibility in terms of, let's say, termination of a lease. If a commercial tenant chooses to terminate a lease outside of what's agreed, that tenant may be required to buy out the lease. They may be required to pay to the landlord. That unpaid
the remaining time.
The remaining time in the lease.
Okay. But you don't have different types of commercial lease. You just have a commercial lease, but you've got your terms and conditions and things in that lease, right?
Yes, what you may do as an attorney, if you are, let's say, drafting a lease for a shop, a retail shop, 800 square foot retail shop. The provisions that you may include in that lease may be far more simplistic than if you were, say, preparing a lease for a quick service restaurant. Let's say you're a landlord that's renting property to a KFC franchisee or a Burger King franchisee or Pizza Hut. Then there are a lot more other things that will go into that lease concerning waste. How do you manage waste? How do you manage, you know, maintenance issues may be more of importance. Who pays for what? Installation of fixtures. In many commercial leases, the landlord is not responsible for fixtures, for putting in roofing, tiles, air conditioning. All the landlord does is provide basic walls.
Right. Okay. Okay. Because that's a little bit unusual. It's talking about people from the UK as well. They're used to going in and seeing everything done.
Yeah.
So, you know, we just have to understand the differences. You're in a different place. So what about things like, imagine I decided I'm going to rent 1,000 square feet and so I've had to downsize my business and I only need 500 square feet and I wanted to sublet the other 500 square feet. Would I be allowed to do that? Or is it something I would have had to agree before?
Well, it depends on how your lease is written. So generally a lease will allow for subletting and it will be allowed with the consent of the landlord. So the language is such consent ought not to be unreasonably withheld. So it would be advisable to go to the landlord and explain that you have a tenant. You're still responsible for the rent because the contract is in your name. But you may be putting in drywall, dividing the property into two and giving access to someone else. And that could work either in a residential or commercial circumstance. But certainly what I would recommend is if you're going into a commercial lease, you may get away in some instances not having an attorney review your residential lease. But if you're getting into a commercial lease, it's very important that you get legal advice because the common law presumption is that you know what you're getting into.
Right, okay. What about rent increases?
So major distinction between both classes of leases, residential and commercial leases. So we know under the Rent Restriction Act, you're limited to a 7.5% annual increase in rents. That applies as well to commercial leases, except where you apply to the Rent Restriction Board for an exemption. And so once you apply for that exemption, your annual increase is really based on what both parties negotiate. And that generally be dictated by demand and supply. If you're in an area that is of high demand, then the landlord tends to hold the handle where rent increases is concerned.
Okay, so who's responsible for insuring the building?
Well, the landlord, it's his asset. And a prudent landlord would not want to leave the protection of that asset to a tenant. So it's the responsibility of the landlord to insure the premises. The tenant has a responsibility of maintaining insurance for the contents. Because you would not want to have, you know, an adverse event, let's say a fire caused internally, you know, or theft, if there's theft of goods. Let's say a commercial tenant who is in the distribution business, he or she would want to make sure their contents are insured. That would be the responsibility of the landlord.
Sorry. What about public liability? So somebody...
As well, the tenant would want to make sure they have. You also have occupiers liability in law. So the person who occupies the premises may be liable for any harm that comes to someone who comes into the premises. What I do, or what we do in our leases, is make sure that the tenant indemnifies the landlord against any potential claims that could arise from, someone coming into occupation.
Right. Okay. And one other question: what happens if the landlord goes bust while you're a tenant?
Well, in that instance, we're assuming that the landlord has a mortgage and
Yes.
the bank has foreclosed on the mortgage. That lease agreement remains in force for the tenure of the lease, for the period of the lease. And so any new owner, unless they can negotiate you as the tenant exiting that lease, they take the property with the lease until that lease runs out.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered quite a bit, and I'm looking forward to more questions from our listeners. So, from Paulette Price and Robert Taylor, we hope to see you again on the next episode. Thank you all very much for listening. Please remember to share, subscribe, and like.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.
Thanks, Paulette.
TV, bam bam, on the street, bam bam, in the class, bam bam, then a preacher, bam bam.